Now, Nepal's Prime Minister says the death toll following Saturday's earthquake could reach 10,000. He said his country was on a war footing and called for international help for the 8 million people who are affected. In our studio in central London is Tom Mitchell, Head of Climate and Environment Programmes at the Overseas Development Institute. Good to talk to you, Mr Mitchell. What preparations were there in Nepal for such a catastrophe?
Well, this was really one of the world's most predicted earthquakes. The last big earthquake in the area in 1934, and scientists looking at the record of earthquakes said that there would be a major earthquake every 75 years or so. So in some senses this was overdue, and the international community has known this for some time, has been working with the government of Nepal for nearly 2 decades on earthquake preparations. So in terms of retrofitting schools and hospitals, ensuring they stand up, securing key transport links, and in many senses those efforts seem to have paid off. Now, of course, the death toll unimaginably high here, but in some sense it could have been a lot worse. Look at it in comparison to the earthquake in Haiti in 2010, killing over 200,000 people, the earthquake in Pakistan in 2005, which killed over 60,000 people, and there are a number of others in the last 2 decades where the death toll has been significantly larger. Now, every single person killed is one too many, but I think in the longer period we will begin to realise that the key efforts in advance of this disaster have paid off.
Having said that, our correspondent Colin Brazier, who's there on the scene in his last live, was pointing out that 90% of buildings in the area are not earthquake proof. So yes, there's been some work on some buildings, but 90% of them don't have the capability to withstand a quake of this magnitude.
Yes, that's certainly the case. This is an area that has experienced really rapid urban development in the past 2 decades. We've seen really a very fast expanding city of Kathmandu in the valley. There are 2.5 million people, nearly expanded by 1 million people in the last decade alone. These are predominantly poor people living in poorly constructed houses, and the government of Nepal has rightly focused on key critical infrastructure. But of course, more needs to be done in terms of building codes, compliance of building codes, the skills needed to build earthquake-resistant buildings. And all that is a priority, and a priority for those cities facing similar types of seismic risk to Kathmandu and the area around.
It happened at weekend. It happened at weekend lunchtime, which meant that offices, schools, places where people would have gathered en masse were empty. Do you think that has also minimised the death toll?
Well, it's difficult to say in some ways because actually it's some of those offices, schools, hospitals that are the best protected. They have been the focus of international efforts. And so gathered in those areas, you would imagine that those individuals would have been better prepared and better protected. And it may be actually at some of the homes, some of the more poorly constructed buildings where people would have been gathered at that time on a Saturday that may have been those more vulnerable to seismic hazard. But, I think you have to understand here that the scale of the challenge in earthquake proofing an area like this, a very poor area, is extremely high. A government has to focus on core priorities. And there has to be learning between cities about how to do this. And, the science here tells us that the earthquakes have a certain periodicity. You can give some predictions to earthquakes in some areas, and we have to make sure international efforts are focused on providing resources to those cities who could be next in line. The problem with Nepal has been over time that we're still spending 5 times more on disaster relief than we are on trying to prevent the earthquake. And this is where there is a big challenge for the international community to change the focus and focus on the resilience of key exposed areas.
It's hard though, isn't it? It's hard to get people to commit to international aid. It's much easier to get people to put their hands in their pockets when a disaster has occurred, isn't it? That's just human nature. The geologists had predicted a big earthquake in the next 75 years. It was due. Is that it now? Is another one due? Has this one been big enough? We've had a lot of aftershocks there, and people there are obviously very, very nervous that a further earthquake could be on the horizon.
It's very difficult to tell, and there's certainly, when it comes to earthquake science, there's still a lot of uncertainty. If you look back over the historic record, back nearly 1,000 years, you can see that these types of big earthquakes in the particular set of fault lines in the Himalayas do occur every 75,000 years, but there are cases where there are smaller earthquakes that have occurred more regularly than that. So it would be important to make sure that as the reconstruction effort happens here, and it will need to be a substantial reconstruction effort, that's done so with the next earthquake in mind, and making sure that as the structures are put back up and are rebuilt, that they can withstand really very significant earthquakes in the future.
And with that reconstruction effort, where do you start when a country has been affected in the way that Nepal has?
Well, first thing to say, it is important to provide the key lifelines for people who've lost everything. So water, shelter, sanitation, energy access, absolutely key. But what's important is just to take a little bit of time to make sure that the right kind of construction techniques are being used, the right kind of skills are in place. Rushing to put back everything as quickly as possible is, of course, human nature, but may not necessarily serve the people well in the long term. So the government of Nepal has to take a very clear, planned approach to ensure that the next time an earthquake happens, which is almost certain in this area in the coming decades, that the loss of life and the number of people injured and affected is as minimal as possible.
OK, Tom Mitchell, the head of the Climate and Environment Programme at ODI, good to talk to you. Thank you.